Hi there, Seacrest. Rabbi Leah here. Happy Thursday morning. Hope you're all doing well. I feel the need to sing a little bit this morning, so I hope you will join me. And there's nothing better than we can sing than this traditional prayer that we sing when we wake up in the morning. Moda ani lefanecha, or modeh ani lefanecha. If you are a guy, if you're a gal, it's moda. So I am thankful before you, God. Why am I thankful? Because I opened my eyes and woke up this morning, and the alternative would have been pretty grim. So I'm happy to be here, and let's sing. Moda ani lefanecha, melech chai v'kayam. שהחזרת בי נשמתי בחמלה, רבה אמונתך, רבה אמונתך. I am grateful before you. So we are going to continue our study of Jewish religious movements. And we've come a long way. In fact, if we look at our chart here, which I know is so teeny tiny, but I don't have the ability to blow it up here at home. I'm going to show you close up that we started all the way back in the year 1300 BCE up until about 600 BCE, which was biblical Judaism. And we looked at the fact that Israel was divided into a southern and a northern kingdom. The northern kingdom known as Israel, the southern kingdom known as Judah. We then went into our time period that included Second Temple Judaism, which was from the period of time 600 BCE up until 70 CE. And you'll see off on the side, I hope this isn't showing up backwards in this video, I'll have to look. The Samaritans, which was this group of individuals who were Torah true Jews, and there are some Samaritans still existing today in certain parts of Israel, mostly in the West Bank, consider themselves to be Jewish. However, for purposes of the state of Israel, they do have to, quote, convert to Judaism if they want to be considered really Jewish. So what was going on between 600 BCE and 70 CE? Well, that was the time of the Second Temple in Israel, in Jerusalem, and that was the golden age of the priesthood, lots of sacrifices. That was when you brought your animals to the temple for sacrifice. There was the priestly cult, and then suddenly in 70 CE, we see the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and another fracture into a bunch of groups, namely the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the beginning of Christianity. Now, the reason that Christianity is in red there is simply because this is a ancestry chart, or a chart showing Jewish movements and denominations. And so Christianity is in red because it is not considered Judaism anymore. So the Pharisees were the precursors, the ancestors of the rabbinic movement, the rabbinic Judaism. And thank God for rabbinic Judaism, because once the temple was destroyed, had there not been a move towards rabbinic Judaism, we would not be having this discussion right now, because once the priesthood was out of a job when the temple was destroyed, it was rabbinic Judaism that kept Judaism in existence, basically. The next category, of course, were the Sadducees. The Sadducees were the priestly cult. They were considered to be the hoi polloi, the elite, very politically connected from the Hasmonean dynasty. And they were around for, a little while after the temple was destroyed, but eventually disappeared. I don't know anybody nowadays that says that they are a descendant of the Sadducees, although I would imagine they can somehow trace their lineage back. And then, of course, the Essenes. The Essenes were the peace loving Jews who fled from Jerusalem after the destruction of the temple. Most of them lived in the area of the Dead Sea. They are the ones to whom we ascribe the Dead Sea Scrolls. Many of them lived a very simple lifestyle. Many of them were celibate. They didn't drink. They didn't cut their hair. And they were Torah true Jews. And what's not shown in this graph is another category we talked about known as the Zealots. The Zealots, who were also known as Sicarii, which is the Greek term because of the long bladed knives they used, and they were known to, um, come out of the dark recesses of the streets in Jerusalem and, as revolutionaries are wont to do, to stab um, Romans. And they were revolting against a head tax that had been imposed by the Roman government of all Jews. And eventually they fled. They had a final revolt in the year 73 of, around 70 actually, of the Common Era. They fled, and where did they go to? Some of them ended up at Masada, which was Herod's winter palace. Herod, of course, was one of the kings of Israel, but he was known as a governor king because he was not a Jewish king. He was put in place by the Romans to kind of soften the blow, so to speak. Okay, after the temple was destroyed, we see rabbinic Judaism coming into um, much more of a practice, and we have Jews who have remained in Israel, in Palestine, and we have those who were taken off to Babylonia many, many, many years before. With the destruction of the first temple, but there is again a diaspora, as we called it, a dispersion of Jews into different parts of the world. And this is what begins the trend towards a much more culturally and ethnic focus on religion. The reason being that, you know the expression, when in Rome, do like the Romans do. But when in Spain, do like the Spanish do. When in Morocco, do like the Moroccans do. And so Jews are being dispersed all over the world and beginning to assimilate and acculturate into the societies in which they live and beginning to take up a whole variety of different cultural and ethnic practices, food, music, clothing, and so on. Maimonides, who was born in Egypt, wore a turban on his head and actually wrote a treatise about um, head coverings for men, and wrote that if it's too hot in the summer, that men do not have to have their heads covered. They could take that turban off. So turbans are a far cry from yarmulkes, right? Um, and why would you expect an Egyptian Jew to wear a kippah? That was something that was developed in the Eastern European culture. So, okay, so we are moving quickly through to our modern movements. But first, we have to talk about, and we did, around the year 500 of the Common Era, we start seeing these cultural and ethnic groupings. And we talked about Ashkenaz, Spanish, Mizrahi, Italian, and Karaite. Okay, so we know that and I'm looking at this row up here, which I'm pointing to now at the top of the paper. So we know that the Ashkenaz, oops, sorry about that, don't mean to make you seasick here. The Ashkenaz we know came out of Eastern Europe, and we're going to talk more about this. The Sephardic, Sfarad, meaning Spanish, mostly Spain and Portugal. Mizrahi were those Middle Eastern countries such as, and African countries such as Morocco and Algeria, Iran, Iraq, and so on. And then we have a separate Italian, which is not really not considered Ashkenaz, because Italy is Western Europe, and absolutely, if you go to Italy and you see the synagogues in Florence and in Venice, you see a much more Byzantine and almost more of an Eastern type focus on architecture and so on. And then that very last one at the end says Karaites. And Karaites is a word that comes from the Hebrew word mikra, which means to read. And the Karaites were very, very much Torah focused Jews. Anything beyond the Torah, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Midrash, the commentaries, were, in their view, not given by God. They were human construction, and therefore they are not part of Jewish culture, Jewish belief. So now we're going to start getting into the nitty gritty in our 6th session. And I told you that at the beginning that you can't really understand the kind of Judaisms that we practice today without understanding where they came from and the history surrounding them. So on Tuesday, we talked a little bit about the Enlightenment that took place in the mid-17th up until the early 19th century and the impact that that had on Judaism. And I think that it's important to understand how things began to separate, but we're talking about two distinct things here. We're talking about movements within Judaism, but we're also talking about ethnic and cultural divisions. So I want to talk a little bit about Sephardic Judaism, which is not a separate denomination. It is a cultural tradition. So in Sephardic Judaism, we see the practice of Judaism observed by Spanish and Portuguese Jews and also Maghrebi Jews and Mizrahi Jews. And it's something that's really peculiar to themselves and not shared with other Jews, particularly the Ashkenazim, which is more of a German rite, R-I-T-E. Sephardic Judaism doesn't constitute, as I said, a separate denomination within Judaism. Rather, it's a cultural tradition. So these are primarily Jews who are descendants of the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, meaning Spain and Portugal. And they can be divided into a couple of different categories. Those that were left in those countries after the expulsion of the Jews in 1492 by Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. and those that remain what we call crypto Jews or conversos. You may have also heard the term Marranos, and Marranos is not a term that is used with much frequently anymore because it has its basis in calling Jews by some pretty despicable names. And so I'm not going to use that. But crypto Jews were those Jews who continued to practice their Judaism cryptically in secret. And conversos were those Jews who openly converted to Catholicism, but also practiced their Judaism in secret. So the crypto Jews were those who did not convert and maybe somehow were able to escape notice and blended better with the regular Spaniards and Portuguese for whatever reason. We also know that there were many court Jews at that time living in what was known as the Golden Age of Spain, who served as poets and court musicians and advisors to the royalty of the time. So there were many Jews who were actually accepted, but for the most part, if you did not convert to Catholicism, you were tortured and tried to convince to convert during the Inquisition. And if that still didn't work, you were either killed or you were expelled. And so we see during that era, during that period of time, the great influx of Jews into Palestine at that time, predominantly into the northern area of Palestine, which and into Sfat or Safed or Safat or however you want to pronounce it, but the Hebrew is Sfat, into that area in which many Jews came from Spain and Portugal and started the Sephardic community, which was also entrenched in Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, and for any of you who've ever been to Israel and have been to Sfat, you have seen these magnificent little Sephardic synagogues that are just breathtaking and well, I could wax eloquent on those for a long time, but I won't. So, in religious parlance, so many left and left for the following centuries from Spain and Portugal. In religious parlance, and by many in modern Israel, the term Sephardic is used more broadly to talk about all Jews from the Ottoman or Asian or African backgrounds. In other words, Mizrahi Jews. And I forgot to mention Greece and Turkey and so on. So whether or not these Jews have any specific link, historic link to Spain, many in Israel will use that term Sephardic to mean Jews who are not from Europe. I guess that's the easiest, or at least from Eastern Europe. So Spain, Portugal, um, um, Morocco, Turkey, Greece, Iran, Iraq, Algeria, Tunis. What am I forgetting? I don't know what I'm forgetting, but if I'm forgetting anything, I'm sure you guys will let me know. Okay, so, but there are others who prefer to make the distinction between Sephardim, who were Spanish and Portuguese, and the Mizrahi Jews, who are all those other non-Ashkenazic categories. Sephardic Judaism does not have movements. So unlike Ashkenazim, which has many movements, many streams, many different flavors of practice, Sephardic Judaism doesn't have Orthodox, conservative, and Reform. The level of halachic practice is left to each person. But most Sephardic Jews would be considered Orthodox, if we were to give them a label, by non-Sephardic Jews. And they primarily run according to the Orthodox tradition. So even though many Sephardic congregants might not keep a level of observance on a par with traditional Orthodox belief, so for example, many Sephardic congregants will drive to their Orthodox synagogues on Shabbat, which is in violation of halakha, and then they'll discreetly enter the synagogue from a back entrance so that they don't offend the more observant Sephardic congregants. Kind of interesting, right? And unlike predominantly Ashkenazi Reform and Reconstructionist denominations, Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews who are not observant generally believe that Judaism's orthodox interpretation and legislation, meaning halakha, is appropriate and true to the original philosophy of Judaism. So even Sephardic Jews who would consider themselves to be non-observant would say that orthodoxy and halakha is truer to Jewish practice than anything else. And this is pretty well documented. There's been a well-known, well-documented traditions that can be linked back to some of the codifiers of Jewish law, Ashkenazi and Hasidic rabbis, that would agree with many of the positions held by Sephardic Orthodoxy. So we see some similarities there. The differences are mainly cultural and ethnic. Sephardic food is nothing like Ashkenazi food. And I can vouch for that personally because I have been fortunate enough to dine with Sephardic families, both in Israel and in the United States. And the food is amazing. And you would eat what you would expect you would eat. Things like borekas, which are from the Sephardic tradition, baklava, which is from the Sephardic tradition. You would expect to eat things like grape leaves stuffed in with rice. And particularly those dietary differences become much more significant at Pesach, when Sephardic Jews will eat the kinds of things that Ashkenazi Jews, for whatever reason, and we could talk about that later, will not eat. Things known as kitniot, and those are lentils and legumes, rice, beans, peanuts, and things of that nature. And you would expect that because these were staples of the Sephardic diet. These were the kinds of crops grown in Sephardic countries, and you would expect that those items would continue to be eaten. They didn't grow potatoes in Morocco. They grew rice, they grew beans, they grew chickpeas, they grew nuts, and so on. So I know a lot of Ashkenazi Jews who suddenly become Sephardic Jews during Pesach so that they can eat kitniot. Okay, now we're going to talk. So we talked about Sephardic Jews. Now we're going to talk about the Ashkenazi movements and denominations. And this is very different from Sephardic Judaism in that there are many, many, many denominations within Ashkenazi Judaism. So first and foremost, let me show you where we are on our little chart here. Here is Ashkenaz, Ashkenaz, Let me put my finger on it right there, Ashkenaz. And as you see, the very first branch coming off of Ashkenaz Judaism is Hasidism, Hasidic Judaism. And then it's out of Hasidic Judaism, which was, of course, a great-grandchild of biblical Judaism, that this stream or this movement developed. So, what is Hasidic Judaism? First of all, it was founded in the early 18th century by Israel ben Eliezer, who you may know as the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov, also known as the Besht, that is the abbreviation for his name. So what does Baal Shem Tov mean? It means the Lord or the Master of the Good Name. And he had they had previously called themselves, the Hasidim had called themselves the Freilichen. What is Freilich? The happy ones. And they now call themselves Hasidim, and from the word chesed, which means the pious ones. So his disciples, and by the way, he lived from 1700 to 1760, his disciples attracted many, many followers among Ashkenazi Jews, and they established numerous Hasidic groups around Europe. And the Baal Shem Tov, the Besht, in the early 18th century, came at a time when Jewish masses of Eastern European Jews were reeling in bewilderment and disappointment because there had been they're still waiting for the Mashiach to come. It's now 1700. The Mashiach hasn't come. And yet there were two false messiahs who had come and created an uproar in the Eastern European Jewish communities and had led to great disappointment among Jews. The first of whom was Shabtai Tzvi, a very interesting character who we could do an entire course on alone. And he was around from 1626 to 1676. And then Jacob Frank from 1726 to 1791. And they had thousands and thousands of followers because these followers were duped into thinking that these were really the Messiah. And as you can see from the years with Shabtai Tzvi in the early 17th to late 17th century, and then 50 years later, Jacob Frank from the early 18th to the late 18th century, we have this period of time in which there is a great amount of disillusionment, sadness, bewilderment, disappointment among the Eastern European Jews. And they are waiting for somebody to come along to bring some freilach into their lives. And Israel ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov, was just the person to do that. And so we're going to talk about Hasidic Judaism more because it's important to see how the movement against Hasidic Judaism led to all these other streams of Judaism. And we're going to do that next week on Tuesday. We're going to begin that on Tuesday. So now you know everything about Sephardism and Sephardic Jews. And you're going to learn more about Hasidism than you ever wanted to know. But it's important to know how we got from this Hasidism to all of this. And this is where we are, down here. So I'm going to wish you Lehitraot. Bye-bye. I hope you join me on Tuesday of next week for Chai There with Rabbi Leah. In the meantime, have a fabulous day, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.